I really prefer catchy and concise titles. This is really one of them. So I'm really looking forward to accepting our invitation. You have 60 minutes and we leave 15 minutes at the end, but Andra says she was happy to take questions from the audience throughout.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining, everybody. It's so nice to see so many familiar names, if not faces. This is early stage work with Eva, who's also online. In some sense, it's early stage. In some sense, we've been working on it for, I think, 3-4 years. What we're sort of interested in this paper is really what cities can do to help firms create jobs. And as many of you know, this is an old question. We are not the first to ask this question. However, as you probably know, cities spend a ton of money trying to attract jobs and how to retain jobs. But we still don't know that much about how cities can make themselves attractive to employers. So what we are doing in this paper that's new is we're actually going to look within firms. So our idea here is to look at firms that have operations in multiple cities. And then what we want to do is see, okay, so what city characteristics encourage firms to expand employment into cities? So suppose you are a firm that has employment in both Chicago and Salt Lake City. So you already have a presence. And you are trying to decide, so, okay, I need to expand operations because I've had some increase in demand for my product that's not specific to Salt Lake and not specific to Chicago. How do I decide whether to expand employment in Chicago or expand employment in Salt Lake City? So that's the setting we're going to be using, and it addresses some of the identification concerns that have been challenging for previous work. We have some that are still a struggle, but that's the idea, use within firm variation employment across cities over time. As you might imagine, if you're Walmart Bakery, the demand in both Salt Lake City and Chicago is going to be largely how many people there are in Salt Lake City and Chicago for your Walmart Bakery products. And that's not super interesting, because what we're really interested in doing is saying kind of, what are the productivity characteristics of Chicago or Salt Lake that might cause you to expand employment? And so what we're going to try to do is separate firms into those that are more non-tradable and more tradable. That's the goal here. You may be familiar with the Mian Sufi definition of tradable and non-tradable industries from their 2014 Econometrica paper. We were really excited to use that until we discovered that Walmart bakeries are in the tradable good. And this became a bit of a challenge for us. So that's why we came up with our own index of non-tradability to try to separate these firms. So this is, again, it's a long literature on agglomeration economies and the productivity characteristics of cities. Historically, this literature has focused on industry level employment across cities. And that made perfect sense when we didn't have the quality of data we have now. Right now, we have higher quality data, we believe, because we have this establishment level data. So again, we're focusing on firm level employment and employment growth of the individual firm. We think this is unlikely to alter city characteristics. And we're going to be able to control for firm by year fixed effects. And again, we want to focus on locations in which firms already have an established presence to account for sorting. Leah, go ahead. By the way, the way my screen is set up, I'd rather you just jump in. Feel free to raise your hand if there's a bunch of questions, but Leah, go ahead.
Thanks, Andra. Just a simple question. Is city a metro area or a city a political city?
It is a CBSA. Very good question. We mean a CBSA, so the sort of economic unit, not the political boundaries. Make sense?
Yes, but I muted myself. So yes, thank you, Andra.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I'm probably focused on my slides, so if you have a question, just interject. If there's too many questions, I'll go back to the hand system, but for now just let's interject. Okay, so here's the sort of conceptual framework we have in mind. Firms are going to operate in multiple cities, and each city is going to have a different productivity. So firm I, located in city C, produces output using, we're going to say something like a Cobb-Douglas technology, but where you have a determinate level of labor and capital input, so diminishing returns. And ACT is city level productivity. So cities each have a different productivity, and that productivity can differ throughout time. And then there's going to be a firm specific productivity. And that is going to depend, it's going to vary over time. And you can also think of these productivity characteristics as including capital not specific to city C. And then LICT and KICT are labor and real estate used in city C at time T respectively. Now they're only going to produce in city C if at some point in the time there was some variable, let's call it M. And this is not something interesting to us, that we're not going to study this, but we think it's a threshold level. And it could be something like the CEO was born in that city, or the CEO had grad school friends in that city, or it could be that they happened to get, tax credits 20 years ago. That's not really of interest to us. We want to focus on cities that have an established presence. So they produce in that city if M way back when was above some threshold level. And we're going to focus on the evolution of the labor input in the firm-city pair over time.
Andra,
Yeah.
question. It's Lee again. You have a city time-specific productivity, but you don't have industry there. I'm assuming that's a deliberate decision. Can you talk about like what is that's in the city that's not industry specific that helps your productivity?
Oh, so lots of stuff. It could be stuff like the overall size. So your great question, Leah. And some agglomeration economies we think operate within an industry, and some agglomeration economies are going to operate at the citywide level. We're going to measure. We could incorporate the industry specifically and look at how that matters for the firm. One of the things we find in our data, a lot of firms, we're going to be focusing on fairly large firms. And a lot of these firms actually have employment in multiple industries. And so it's a little tricky. We could assign them to, wherever they have the industry, they have the most employment. But for now, we're going to maybe wait until we look at the characteristics that we think might be driving ACT. Does that make sense?
That is okay. Thank you.
Okay. But, the industry specific productivity is mostly going to be captured by this firm by time fixed effect.
Andra, you're when you say like you're going to use that, like, I guess J, that you're going to prevail upon that J being kind of long ago and therefore kind of exogenous to all the choices that the firm is making at the moment. Is that, I mean, that's like it seems like a purposeful setup that you're worried about something contemporaneous that might contaminate a selection effect or something. Is that?
I think what we were more worried about, Jonathan, is if you set up the problem so that firms are choosing from sort of all 900 and some odd MSAs in the United States, it becomes an intractable problem, right? So I think we don't see firms truly choosing from all MSAs in the United States when they choose to expand production. And so we're saying so there's a limitation here in that we're not studying the drivers of how a firm gets to the point where they have a presence in Chicago or Salt Lake. And that's an interesting question, right? That's a really interesting question. Entrepreneurship. I think for small firms, it's often, where the entrepreneur happens to live. But that's really why we set it up, so that we're focusing on the choice being you're expanding or contracting employment in the cities you already have a presence. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of interesting questions here. We originally sort of were thinking, let's give them any choice. And then the problem becomes really intractable if you allow any set of decisions. Okay, so we don't observe output at the firm city time level. So for those of you who are familiar with we're using the data axle / info group data. They have modeled sales at the establishment level, but it's all modeled, right? And there is sort of a question of how you think about within firm. Like if I make a widget in Chicago and I transport it to Salt Lake, where do you assign output within the firm? So we don't really observe output at the city firm level, but we do observe labor input. And that's going to allow us to recover the drivers of productivity at the city level. We're going to normalize our output price to 1, and we're going to condition on firms having some employment in city C at time, 2 years ago. That's going to be our benchmark 2 years ago. And then they're going to choose their labor input in that city and their capital input to maximize profits. And what we get is you're going to get optimized output as a function of city productivity, firm specific productivity, wages, the rents specific to city C, and then these parameters. And so then we can take optimal labor input. We can just take logs of this and get that your employment is going to be a function of the productivity in that location, of the firm specific productivity, and then of wages and rents in that city. Okay, so we're going to, city level productivity, we think is going to be governed by observable productivity characteristics and then some unobservable component. And then, as you might guess, the wages and the rents are also in equilibrium going to be determined by the productivity of workers in that location, as well as some non-productivity related characteristics. So we're going to call our non-productivity wage characteristics XW. And so you should think of these as something like, I might be willing to accept a lower wage if I am near the ocean, or if I am near mountains, or if it happens to have particularly good schools or something. Charles, go ahead. Charles? Okay, I'll keep going. But interject anytime, Charles. Rents, similar, right? So there's going to be some component of rents that's going to be determined by the productivity of that location. And then there's going to be another set of characteristics unrelated to productivity. So this might be something like, again, how mountainous the region is, how much of it is abutted by a body of water. It could also be something like the level of regulation. So we don't think all of this is going to be regulation. So what we can do is we can recover the full effect to the extent that we want to recover the productivity characteristics of a city that drive firms to choose to expand employment in that location. We can insert our equation for wages and our equation for rents into our equation for labor, so that we get the overall effect of the productivity characteristics, where gamma A is going to be this, gamma A is going to be capturing the overall effect. So gamma W captures the effect of the non-productivity related characteristics that drive wages at the city level, and gamma K captures the non-productivity related characteristics that drive rents. Okay, and then we have this error term that has all these parameters.
And Andrea, this is Luis. Do these not observable non-productivity characteristics apply equally for any worker in any industry, right? Not one industry benefits more from being near the ocean than others.
Yeah. So right now, you're right. There's no J. So we could think about, do you have in mind that workers in, say, tech care more about proximity to the ocean than workers in...
Or proximity to, I don't know, good schools with good, I don't know, STEM education. But conversely, I was also thinking about the productive characteristics and the difference in how they could affect tradable and non-tradable. So if you're in a tradable industry, location, for example, could make a big difference versus non-tradable. But this is extending my question to whether the productivity related amenities affect tradables and non-tradables equally or differently.
Yeah, so great question. I don't think that we are really able to identify. So, okay, let's go back to sort of our conceptual framework here. So it's a good question about tradable versus non-tradable industry. Our sort of working assumption here is that we're not capturing local demand shocks, that the firm's decision, and we should probably make this more explicit in the paper, our sort of working assumption is the firm has some change in demand for its product, its output. And it's only choosing sort of which city to do that in. And the overall demand for a product is not specific to the city. I think when you get into non-tradable goods, the challenge is that then you're capturing a local demand shock. And so then it's not, and you can't really choose. So if I get a huge increase in demand locally for baked goods in Chicago, I can't really transport them from Salt Lake City. I basically have to be producing them in Chicago.
Yeah, okay. So because I assume that that's what you were doing, because you talk about, and in the paper you make a difference between tradables and non-tradables. So I thought it was because this margin of adjustment, if I get a shock in Salt Lake City, is available for firms that have multiple plants in different places, but only if they're tradable and not in their non. So I thought you were going to use that for identification.
Yeah. So that we're going to focus. I'm going to show you results for all firms, and then I'm going to show you results for firms that we think produce tradable output and firms that we think produce non-tradable output. So just be patient with this, but I do think it's a challenge. And some of the goods that we thought, I brought up the Walmart bakery example. The other example we found that seemed like it would be a tradable good, Coca-Cola bottling. It turns out Coca-Cola bottling had operations in 330 cities. So it seems like a manufactured good. It seems like it would be a tradable good, but because of the transportation costs, it doesn't really, the value, is the cement problem, right? So cement also seems like should be a tradable good, but when you take into account transportation costs. So I don't want to, get too far down the line, but we mostly think that a lot of what's going on, it's more of an index, I think. It's not as sort of a binary thing, but try to think of it as a binary thing for now, but we're actually going to think of it as a continuum of how tradable a good is, rather than a distinct level. Okay, so going back, so this is what we're basically going to estimate. We're going to estimate employment as a function of these city-specific productivity characteristics, wage characteristics that drive wages unrelated to productivity, and characteristics that drive rent unrelated to productivity. Tony, go ahead. Tony, can you speak up a little bit? We're having a hard time hearing you. I can't really hear you, Tony. I'd love to hear your question because I know you contributed a lot to this literature. Maybe you can put it in the chat, or we can figure out audio later, because we're very grateful for all feedback at this point. But I can't really hear you. So let's try this again later. Okay, so that's our estimating equation. And you guys have already asked about some of these. What are these productivity characteristics? So the first one is specialization. And we're going to measure specialization at the city level. We are basically taking the maximum. So employment here is in city C. So what fraction of employment in city C, industry S time T, does that account for overall employment in that industry year? So we're basically, it's a city level variable. Now we could, and maybe we will in the next draft, look at matching the firm's industries to the specialization. We might consider doing that. We haven't done that in this draft. But that's our city level measure of specialization right now. The other characteristic that the literature has suggested is going to drive productivity is diversity. So this is almost the opposite of specialization, where it's basically looking at how diverse a city's industry base is. Either you can think of it as an alternative measure of diversity or a control. The number, so this diversity measure, the literature has shown is very sensitive to how many industries are actually represented in the city. So we're also going to control for the number of 3-digit NAICS industries that have positive employment in the city. And then we're going to look at labor competition. So out of how many establishments per employee are there in city C at time T relative to the national average? And then we're going to look at things like employment density, the physical size of the city. We're going to how educated the city is. So we're going to proxy for the share with a college degree. And then we have several geographic variables. So this is stuff like the whether it's mountainous, temperatures, so July temperatures, January temperatures, July humidity, January days of sunshine, and then rent determinants. So, you know, some of these geographic variables are going to capture the physical limitations to adding housing supply, but then there's these man-made limitations to housing supply that have increased over time. Okay, so the data is coming from Data Axle /Info Group. It's from 1997 to 2021. We observe the establishment identity. We know the parent firm. We know the location, and we're going to aggregate to the city level, CBSA. We know the industry actually down to like at least 6-digit NAICS. It might even be the 8-digit NAICS, but we're going to focus on either kind of 2 or 3-digit NAICS codes. And then we know employment. We're going to focus on firms with at least 500 employees. So these are going to be pretty large firms. Why do we want this? Is we want firms that really do have a choice of where to produce. And we want them to be producing in multiple cities. We're going to match our firm CBSA year panel of employment with CBSA year drivers of agglomeration economies. So we have the size of the city from the US Census Bureau's Tiger shapefiles, ACS data on educational attainment. Our consumption amenities come from the US Department of Agriculture. And then we have the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index for 2 points in time. And we're going to interpolate between those years and extrapolate for years we don't have it. Okay, so here's the mix of industries, and this is all industries at this point. I have not separated the industries into tradable versus non-tradable. So a lot of firms are in manufacturing, and this is by the parent headquarters. So again, a lot of these firms are going to have employment in multiple industries. So this is by the parent location. Professional services, public admin, you know, a little bit in agriculture, but this is it's a fairly diverse set of firms. Our top 10 cities by key characteristics. So New York is both the physically largest as well as the densest. The large cities all seem to have employment in, you know, almost 100 industries. There's a lot of variation in, fair bit of variation in education and regulation. And there's a lot of variation in density. So New York is, you know, almost 4 times as dense as places like Houston, Atlanta, Dallas. I was a little surprised to see that Los Angeles was almost as dense as New York. But I think what's going on here is effectively the Los Angeles sort of broader area separated to 2 CBSAs, where one is sort of Orange County, Irvine, whereas New York is, you know, you got a tri-state area that is, you know, 17 million people or something. So the most diverse industries most diverse cities are Chicago, Atlanta, and most competitive, San Francisco and Los Angeles, with Washington being the most specialized. So what I want to show you now is if I collapse to the firm year level, so the median firm here in our sample has about 21 establishments, and they have a presence in 10 different cities. 18, they're represented in 18 years. Overall employment, about 941 is the median. Sorry, I should have said that the sorting criteria is that they have at least 500 employees in some year. So we obviously need to do a little bit of data cleaning with our zero employment here. Somehow we need to check what's going on there. But what's surprising to us is how often they're opening a new establishment. And we also find they go into a new city fairly frequently. In almost a third of firm years, we observe them entering a new city. Euro.
Hi, many cities provide subsidies and tax benefits and so on. How do you handle those things, and how do you distinguish those location-based policies from your location preferences and productivity and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. We did look at, what we can observe is corporate tax rates at the state level. Some of the, I think what Caitlin Slattery and Owen Zidar have done, they've also documented some of the discretionary subsidies. Those are harder for us to observe. We didn't find that corporate tax rates really mattered. We did try them in a restaurant. They're not in any of the specifications I'm going to show you today, but they just didn't seem to matter in terms of attracting, at least expanding employment. Now, what they might matter more for is when firms choose to go into a new city. So I think you might have in mind things like the Amazon HQ2 competition, right? Those are not really what we're picking up here. We're looking at if they have presence in 2 cities or 3 cities or 10 cities, as it turns out, how do they choose which city to expand employment in? Okay, we can also, our main left-hand side variable here is going to be a firm city year combination. And so what we see here is in the firm city year, they typically have, the median is 1 establishment, typically at 14 years in the sample. They're relatively small on average in any sort of firm city year. And then the maximum employment they have in any of these one city so this is representing how much employment, how much of the firm's overall employment is in the city in which they have the maximum amount of employment. And that's about 22%. And then the minimum share is quite small. It's only about 1% of overall employment. So again, one of the things we found a little surprising was how geographically dispersed firms are, and as well as how dynamic firms are. So they're frequently opening new establishment and expanding operations into new cities. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to match of our firm's CBSA years that we can observe in the data Axel data. Let's match them now with our city characteristics. And the main ones we're looking at density, so employment divided by the city scale, the total area, city level specialization, city level diversity, competition, so labor market competition, how many employees are there per establishment, education, so this is the Share College, this is our Wharton Regulatory Land Use Index, and then these are our amenity variables, so mean January temperature, mean January sun, mean July temp, mean July humidity, percent water, so how much of the land area is water, and then whether or not it's mountainous. So we've just collapsed the USDA categories into a binary variable. These variables, as you might expect, are kind of correlated with one another. Our hope is the next draft to come up with how many days a year do you have San Diego weather? Because I think that's really sort of capturing how many days do you have sort of pleasant weather, that it's not humid and fairly sunny. But we have it right now, we're just using the raw USDA data. Okay, so this non-tradability index. We are interested in identifying city characteristics that drive productivity. These can differ from the city characteristics that increase population. And again, you're kind of mechanically getting that you're going to expand production in response to local demand shocks when you include goods that have to be consumed in the same location that they are produced. Again, the earlier iterations of this project, we tried to use existing measures, and we were confounded by Walmart bakeries because we sort of looked through the data, like, why are we getting that a manufacturing firm is producing in 900 some odd cities, or I think at the Coca-Cola bottle, it was like 300. So what we want to, if we basically looked at what drives the increase in employment in Walmart bakeries, it's not really about the city characteristics that make a bakery worker more productive. So what we want to do is look at the subset of firms that can produce their output in an MSA far from where it is consumed. That's our rough idea of what a tradable good is. So what we're going to do is we're going to define the non-tradability of a firm's output by how geographically dispersed production is. Obviously, large firms are going to have employment in more locations. So we're going to just scale by total firm employment. So our non-tradability index is the total number of CBSAs that firm I has production in year T, divided by firm level employment in year T. And we're going to standardize by subtracting off the mean and dividing by the standard deviation of this measure across firm years. So that's sort of our benchmark idea. So the idea is, like, if I have 1,000 employees, but I'm consuming, I have to produce it in 200 CBSAs, this suggests to me that whatever I produce has to be more or less consumed in the place that that it is produced, that either transportation costs are too high or it's perishable. Maybe that's the case with the Walmart bakeries. Either it's heavy relative to the value. So there's a lot of reasons that a good might be non-tradable. We're not going to take a stance on this. Whereas if, suppose I have, Boeing might be the ultimate example of a truly tradable good, right? Because Boeing is produced in like 3 or 4 cities, I think. And obviously a huge amount of employment, because given the value of the output, and we don't have, the aircraft does not stay in Seattle in the DC metro area. Okay, so
the non-tradability index here varies with firms and not with product.
Great question.
Right?
Excellent question. Yes.
Okay.
So we measured it. Yes, excellent question. So it is at the firm level, not by, now you can collapse it to an industry level. And as a check on what we're doing, we wanted to compare. So let's actually go and collapse it to the industry level, the 4-digit NAICS industry level, because that's how Mian Sufi categorize their industries. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Mian Sufi way of getting at tradability, which was super useful, what they do is they look at the geographic dispersion. So they're again looking at geographic dispersion, but at the industry level. So instead of looking within firm, they look at the industry level. I think there's a couple challenges with that. One of them, I think, is that there's some sort of industry competitiveness things that might drive that variation in that variable, right? So you might think that really competitive industries are going to have employment in more locations, in part because it's just easy to start up a firm, right? A industry with low startup costs, low fixed costs, they're going to have employment in more locations. So you're capturing something about the competitive characteristics of the industry as well as the geographic dispersion. But we did want to categorize. So what we've done is we've collapsed our non-tradability index by the Mian Sufi categories. And reassuringly, the tradable Mian Sufi categories, they have a lower score on our non-tradability index than our non-tradable goods. And that's true kind of almost all across the board. So that's reassuring. But what you do notice is that there's a lot of variation within these categories. So we do have a higher mean, median, non-tradability index for industries that Mian Sufi classify as non-tradable based on the geographic dispersion of industry output. But there's a lot of heterogeneity within these categories. So some of the geographic dispersion industry is likely due to the competitive structure of the industry, not how possible it is to trade the good across space. Okay, so our estimating equation, what we're going to do here is we're going to regress the log of employment on log of density, log of total area, log of city level specialization, diversity, number of industries, all in logs, competition, education, and then these amenities I mentioned, the temperature variables, days of sunshine, mountainous, percent water, regulation, and then in some specifications, we're going to control for the lagged employment of that firm, because even suppose I have 10 employees in Salt Lake City and 1,000 employees in Chicago, and suppose I decide that, oh, Salt Lake City would be more productive, but how do I expand employment by, say, 2,000 employees in Salt Lake City all of a sudden? So to the extent there's adjustment costs, we want to control for lagged employment. It turns out qualitatively, this doesn't change our results, but it does change them quantitatively. So the adjustment costs do seem to be important.
Andra, this is Leah. Do you, when firms talk about moving across cities, it seems like they talk a lot about the ease of doing business, which I don't feel is captured too well by any of these controls. Do you have any way of measuring something like that? Do you think that's important?
That's a great question. I think we can, there are like, I think maybe Fortune or Bloomberg or somebody puts out these indexes, ease of doing business.
You know, like how easy to get a permit for opening your new business, and I don't know, like stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't know that it's going to matter as much for expanding employment in these locations. I mean, you do still, oftentimes you do need permits to open new establishments, right? So expansion employment might be new establishments. A lot of it is within establishment. But I do think we could include that. Yeah, you're sort of getting at one limitation of our analysis is that it could be that the characteristics that drive expansion of employment within large firms that already have a presence are a little different than what makes firms jump to a new city entirely. So and same with the entrepreneurship. So we can't really study that in this frame. And it could be, there is the possibility that those are different things. Particularly, I think probably the entrepreneurship is even more important. So how firms, what cities foster firm births, like truly new firms, but we don't, that's just sort of where we have light right now.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
A lot of the regulatory differences that might affect the things that Leah is pointing out could vary at the state level, right? So if you included state level effects, then that could capture a great source of variation there.
Yeah.
Could control for those.
Yeah, I mean, we might actually want to study those, though. I mean, that's what we did with the corporate taxes, was we actually, I don't know how much, I think we absorb some of the variation we would want to capture across cities with state fixed effects. But yeah, with corporate tax rates, what we were finding is they seem to matter for non-tradable employment, but not tradable employment. But wait till I show you those results, and then you'll see why they matter for non-tradable employment.
Andra, just one other question. Sorry to distract.
No, this is great.
Progress here. Tell me what you mean by the unbalanced panel, in the sense that, so I gather you have some shutdowns within an industry here. So you have some log of zeros. So what do you do with those?
The log of zeros are not in, they should not be in the sample. So we're measuring employment in levels. So if there's no employment, that's not in the sample.
Oh, okay. So if the firm leaves the city, you just end it in the period before they left.
Yeah, so it will be in that period. Yeah, so in these specifications, we're gonna yes. So if they if it's 0, it's not going to be in our regression. But it means that for some firms, we're going to have, like, say, 10 years. For some firm city years, we're going to have 10 years. For some firm city years, we're going to have 14 years, depending on when they went in the city and if they left the city.
Andra, how could housing markets and housing costs potentially affect this employment equation? Or do you have any reason to exclude housing factors in this equation?
It's a great question. So remember, what we are interested in, we are explicitly interested in rents, right? So to the extent that we're looking at a production factor, but obviously commercial rents are going to be related to residential rents, right? If you restrict land use, you drive up commercial rents as well. But what we're actually separating our rent variable into the portion of rents that are driven by productivity and the portion of rents that are driven by characteristics that drive rents unrelated to productivity. Because if you just throw in rents, it's kind of a bad control problem, because you're kind of taking away the portion of the productivity characteristics that are also affecting rents, right? So if you think that, for example, Tom's on this call, or Tom was on this call, and I know he's going to make the fair point that a lot of the places that are very productive also have natural amenities that make it hard to measure, but are hard to build. But cities that are very productive, if they have any inelasticity in land supply, they're going to have higher rents, right? But that's not necessarily they get higher rents because it's more productive, right? So that's why we wanted to separate it. So that's why we separate the rents into the productivity characteristics and the non-productivity. Okay. Last thing before I show you some results, we're going to split our sample into tradable firms and non-tradable firms. Tradable firms, I'm going to define as those with a non-tradability index below the 25th percentile. And non-tradable firms are going to be those with a non-tradability index above the 75th percentile. Okay, so which agglomeration economies matter? The first thing, regardless of how of what you could sort of include, so the first 3 columns, I'm including all firms, those in tradable industries, those in non-tradable industries, and everything in between. And the first specification, I'm not going to include firm by year fixed effects. I'm only looking at the set of observations for which I can identify firm by year fixed effects, but I'm not going to include them. The next specification, we are now going to be able to control for firm by year fixed effects. And what you see is density and city size actually matter more. The coefficients increase once you control for the selection of the firms in different cities. So it does seem to be a causal relationship, even controlling for firm selection. And then this third column, now we're going to control for lagged employment to capture some of these adjustment costs. And again, the coefficient is strongly significant, even controlling for firm year fixed effects. Columns 4 through 6. Now what we're doing is we're restricting the sample to firms in tradable industries. Same order of columns as before. Column 4 does not control for firm by year fixed effects. Column 5, we are able to control for firm by year fixed effects. And then column 6, firm by year fixed effects with lagged employment. Similar story though, you get an increase. Density and city size seem to matter even more after you control for the firm selection into different cities. And we get broadly the same story when we look at these non-tradable firms. Okay, when we look at these drivers of the sort of industrial characteristics, it seems to matter a lot more whether we look at tradable versus non-tradable industries. So specialization never matters. So that doesn't seem to be, it matters a little bit when we don't control, when we both look at all firms and we don't control for the firm selection into different cities. Diversity actually, so the diversity of the industrial base, both measured by this main diversity variable, as well as the number of industries, that seems to have a positive effect on employment. And we think, again, columns 4 through 6, where we focus on these tradable firms, that's where we're capturing the productivity effect. And here you see industrial diversity increases employment consistent with it having a positive effect on productivity. You get the exact opposite story when you look at non-tradable firms. So there does seem to be a need, in our mind at least, to if you're interested in really understanding what drives the firm decision, you want to focus on tradable goods. Similar story with competition.
Sorry, could you repeat the second one that is highlighted? It's the no end is, what is the
number of 3-digit NAICS industries that are represented. So again, there's been some concern that this diversity measure is really sensitive to how many industries are actually represented in that city, because remember, this is a share, how it's like a Herfindahl index, an inverse Herfindahl index. And so you also want to control for the number of industries, but you could interpret the number of industries as its own measure of diversity, right? If you have more industries represented, presumably you're more diverse. So it's, so this is the number of industries. And then competition, we actually find that competition is bad for productivity. Again, in our tradable firms, we see a negative effect. Very different story if you look at non-tradable firms. And then education, it's a little puzzling that at least when we don't control for firm selection, we get a negative coefficient. It goes away once we control for firm selection. We don't really have a good explanation for this. But yeah, that's what we got. And then our regulation variable, we've included in the regression, but I haven't shown you because it was never significant. And then we have our natural amenity variables in there as well. So takeaways here: employment density and city scale both increase employment. The relationship becomes even stronger after you control for the firm selection into different cities. For tradable firms, where the regressions are capturing the drivers of productivity, there's some evidence that industrial diversity increases employment and competitiveness actually decreases productivity. Given the differences in the results between tradable and non-tradable firms, we think it's important to distinguish between what drives employment in all firms and those that make a choice where to produce based on productivity. Limitations, you guys have already brought up some of these. The city level determinants of firm births might not be the same as the drivers of growth within existing firms. And we're also not identifying the drivers of firm entry into a new city. So when Amazon HQ2 is choosing, Amazon is choosing its next headquarters, we're not really looking at the universe of possible cities. Or if Tesla decides to up and move to Texas, we're not really capturing that. But for large firms, which many cities do try to court, cities can increase employment by taking steps to allow for additional density, larger spatial scale, and greater industrial diversity. Okay, that's it. I am happy to keep chatting with people. Again, I really appreciate all your feedback. Mark.
So, I am, with regard to your limitations about startups and shutdowns, it seems to me similar to other problems, such as, to problems where models like Tobit or Crag would be used, where you have a 1-0 binary decision, and then you have decisions at the margin. Would looking at that add to your effort?
I think it's a really good question. I have to think a little bit more about it. Craig is if I learned
CRAGG.
C-R-A-G-G.
GG, CRAGG. So his problem was, do you buy a car? And if you buy a car, how expensive is the car? All right. So similarly, do you start up in City I? And given that you start up in City I, how many employees do you have there? Similar question.
Yeah, I have to think about that. I think it might be a different, I have to still think about how you would control for these 930 options you have. I'll think about it though. Thank you for suggesting it. David.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Can we go back to the question about conditioning on rent?
Yes.
Because it seemed to me, if you are interested in thinking about your results as in the context of a production function, that your caveat on that, or your objection to including rents, is really just a statement about the endogeneity of rents. And then what you would want to do is include rents and include and instrument them, and that perhaps the household amenities would be the ideal instrument for this sort of supply side analysis. So I can imagine that maybe you're not interested in a production function interpretation, and then you want to include both effects, also the effect going through the rents. But it would seem to me that it would enhance our understanding of the results if you also had an instrumented specification with instrumented rents of that form.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I think it's not so much an endogeneity problem as a bad control problem. What I think we might, if we knew what the productivity specific to a city was, you could regress rents and then take out the component of the productivity, take out you'd have a residual of rents that's not the portion of rents not driven by productivity characteristics. Yeah, you could say, I mean, the other thing you could do, I think what you're suggesting is, rather than directly including regulation in these natural amenities, what you're suggesting is regress rents on these natural amenities. And if I understand correctly, David, you're suggesting regress rents on the natural amenities and the regulation variable, and take that as instrumented rents, if you will. I think the problem a little bit is Tom's point, and I think it relates to the fact that a lot of the natural amenity variables also drive wages. I think that's the challenge is, I mean, we'd still want to directly include the natural amenities because they drive wages, and so that belongs in the equation. But I think that's what you're suggesting, right?
Well, so let me. I mean, it seems to me that the first part of your answer was basically a control function solution, which is very much like instrumental variables, just a sort of a different route. And the second one was an actual two-stage instrumental variables. I'm probably 30 years behind in econometrics, so if I'm getting this wrong, then fine. But that seemed to me more or less the same thing. And then your statement about wages would argue to me that maybe also you want rents and wages in there, and that if you had a large enough set of household amenities, then as instruments for both of them, then you've solved your problem. It may come out very noisy, but that's a different issue.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
No, it's an interesting question. And I think the concern I would have is that there's some portion of so suppose the most productive worker, and this is, again, Tom has this really nice paper, I think in Critical Finance Review, that's arguing that, the most productive workers tend to be attracted to cities with these high amenity values. We can control for the weather. What we can't control for, at least not easily, is sort of other sort of man-made characteristics that we can't easily see that attract the highest quality workers. I don't know. We'll think a little bit more about it, but I think that's my concern about directly including them, is that you have drivers of productivity that are going to cap wage. If you control directly for wages, you have drivers of productivity in there, so you're not truly capturing the effect of productivity. Other questions? Luis.
Sorry, I was muted. So if I interpret the results of the last regression table you showed, for example, the number of industries have a different effect on tradables and non-tradables. Same thing for the competition, right? And in the final slide, you mentioned that cities could allow for greater industrial diversity to attract firms. Is it, is it correct to say, yes, if you're not really attracting firms because you're not looking at that margin of adjustment, right? You're looking at firms that stay where they are. So is it okay to say that it would be more accurate that if cities want to attract employment growth from tradable cities they already have, but tradable firms they already have, then they should increase industrial diversity. But if they're filled with non-tradable industries, then they shouldn't.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what these regressions really capture other than population growth in the non-tradable industries. So I didn't show you the natural many variables, but what you find is like non-tradables are increasing rapidly in cities with high July temperatures and high humidity. And I think this is mostly that people are moving to places like Atlanta and Dallas because it's cheap. And it's not really productivity, it's that's where, so I think there might be sort of different drivers of population than what drive productivity. So this is sort of, I mean, there's also just differences in fertility across these cities, right? To the extent that I think it's just capturing different things. And so I guess our feeling is that columns 7 through 9 are like, you could rephrase it as not what drives productivity, but what drives population. Because obviously population is closely linked with employment, but it's not a choice about where it's produced at this point. It's just where's the population growing.
Yeah, so the margin of, basically everything that is following productivity is a margin of adjustment that can be done for tradables. So we shouldn't interpret it the same way for the non-tradable results. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that you will also, because columns 4 through 6, they identify productivity characteristics, or at least that's the goal. Whereas columns, and yes, if you increase, presumably, and this might be, you guys have suggested that we look more within industry and whether there's a little bit, whether we can find differences in the characteristics that increase productivity within some industries and not others. Could you, if those are the same across all industries in our tradable group, we could probably feel more comfortable saying these will probably also increase productivity in your non-tradable industries. If they turn out to be very different, maybe that's a different message. Yeah. Mark.
So I may have missed what you had to say about your education.
Yeah.
Variable. It seems to have a negative impact on in most columns, sometimes significant. Yep. Do you have an interpretation?
Yeah, so again, these columns 1 through 1, 4, and 7, where it really is showing up. Here we're not able to control for the firm selection. So once we control for firm selection, it seems to largely disappear. And certainly once we control for adjustment costs, but we do not have an interpretation for this. It would be, I would rather have shown you results where that doesn't have any stars on it, but the data is what it is.
Well, I mean, maybe it means something and we just don't know what it means.
It's really hard to think of theories where where, given how, the overwhelming evidence on how much more productive college workers have become relative to non-college educated workers, it's kind of, it would be shocking if there was any, I don't know of any theory that should suggest a negative. And so I guess my prior is so biased by theory that it should have a positive sign. I mean, the only thing I can say is density is pretty correlated with education, as well as sort of some of our number, but yeah, I'm going with theory here, barring like triple stars on in every specification. I'm going to go with theory here.
Andrew, have you tried just dropping DC, which is a huge outlier in education?
We have not tried dropping DC. Let me, thank you. That might, yeah, because DC is like, 50% college share or something.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank
It
you.
also has tons of government workers, so it's just a weird economy.
Because they're government workers, yeah. It's a great question. Yeah, we can try to look at that. Tom. Maybe not. Okay, if there's no further questions, I'll give you guys 10 minutes of your time back. But thank you so much again for attending.
Wait.
Oh.
It's not like it's that important, but what the heck?
No,
just sorry, I was muted and didn't think that through. Just on education, right? If you've got sort of population through density, and these guys like to hire low-skill workers, to the extent that these are low-wage jobs, it would seem, this is the pool of, not of people available to work, in manufacturing.
yeah,
Right.
I think the fact we're not seeing vastly different things though in our tradable, and so maybe decomposing by industry would help, as some of the other people have suggested, is decomposed. You see different drivers of productivity in different industries. Yeah, we can maybe look at that and see whether meat packing firms really like cities with low education because there's a lot of available workers. Yeah, it's good. We can try to decompose that. Yeah, thanks. David and then Keith.
Yeah, just a quick statement. I mean, I think it's important to have an understanding of the dynamics of the regressors. Some of them are presumably fixed over fixed over time, like AREUEA, right? And other ones
AREUEA does change.
AREUEA does change, but I can't imagine it changes very much. And some of them will be evolving. I think it would be useful for the reader to understand how quickly they evolve relative to employment. I mean, in particular, when I'm comparing across the regressions without a lag and with a lag, clearly a lot of those coefficients are just being cut by 1/10 to accommodate the lagged employment coefficient. And but some of the others not necessarily. And I think there's some kind of dynamic econometrics analysis that would be useful here.
Yeah, we could maybe try a error correction model. That might be another way of.
Right, that's what it kind of looks like a little bit.
Yeah, except we don't have quite the. We could do something a little more sophisticated, if I recall correctly.
Right.
Yeah, but that's fair. Yeah, AREUEA does actually change more than you might think over time. Annexation's a real thing. The natural many variables obviously don't change over time. But the rest of them, yeah, it changed. We could present some statistics on this. It changed more than I anticipated. My prior was the same as you, David, and it does change a bit over time. But we could do more on that front for sure. Keith.
Oh, sorry, I had to give permission there. So I guess with immigration having a larger impact on population growth, have you looked at anything related to that?
We have not. Immigration.
I'm thinking specifically like you typically have like you mentioned the meat packing. You often see a large immigrant population working in meat packing plants. Yeah, things like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, then you sort of ask, because immigration policy is a national variable, right? I mean, I guess there are these. My colleague Troop has a paper where there's some enforcement that varies at the local level, and that's actually so there is enforcement that varies. So it's that would be the. I think you might push the question of like what attracts immigrants to a location, which is an interesting question, but I think the variation you get, I'm trying to remember the name of this policy. Somebody else might know the name of this policy that varies at the local level, but he actually finds that this has a huge effect on housing costs, because if you can't, it's a huge part of the labor force, but we could think about that. Yeah. It's a good question. Sam.
Hey, I was just wondering, so most of the discussion about rents seems like it's been focused on residential rents. I've wondered, have you all thought about bringing like commercial rents into this at all? Because that seems like it would be much more useful and relevant to the expansion of firms, particularly for retail, for non-tradable, and say office or industrial for the tradable firms.
Yeah, so there's definitely the model, we're talking about commercial rents, right? Because space is input into production. Here we don't have households aren't renting space, but it's you can kind of as long as you think there's some substitutability between commercial and residential space, you get the same idea. I think it's more or less the same thing. We can put in commercial rents directly. I think our concern is the same, that commercial rents are also, if you have any inelasticity in land supply at all, you're going to have commercial rents driven by productivity.
It certainly seems like they should be, but I was just going to mention, I don't really know of any evidence that Joe's, the Warren Regulation Index, that I don't think it's really, maybe somebody has been applied to retail, office, or industrial rents, or local amenities, but even more generally, looking at the agglomeration economies, if you get if you can merge the Nets data to neighborhood level commercial rents, that'd be really interesting. But obviously, that's a big data lift.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what you really want to measure, I think, that's not related to productivity is the regulatory component. And our sort of thought on the regulatory component is the ideal measure would have been how much land is reserved in a metro area for single family housing, right? Because this is really what's driving up rents, is that so much, most cities, it's like 80-85% of land that can only be used for single family housing. And we tried to use the CoreLogic data to do this, and we couldn't get enough specificity in how it was being used to come up with a measure that sort of made sense to us. But that's what I think you ideally want, because obviously, if you have 20% of your city's land remaining that has to be used for multifamily housing and commercial, that's obviously going to drive up your commercial rent. So our Wharton Regulatory Land Use Index, it's pretty good. It doesn't vary across time as much as we would like. We'd like to have sort of every year, every city, but we just haven't done better. Rushi.
Yeah, hey, from the presentation, it is very clear why you would want to focus on expansion of existing establishments. But I was very curious about, when a firm decides to expand, do they really go to a new city, or do they expand in the existing cities? And is this behavior different when we think of an expansion of a firm versus a contraction? Because that would have implications on, when we're looking at employment, should we think about expansion separately versus contraction? And just was curious if you had something on that.
It's a great question. And we sort of did a little bit on this. We don't have all the statistics here, but you can see that we basically found that when they expand, when they open a new establishment, it kind of, something like half the time it's in a new city. There's more expansion within cities, but then I think you're also wondering, how much of expansion of employment involves opening a new establishment or a new CBSA. My prior, before starting to look at the data, was that the number of establishments would be something like 4, and the number of cities would be like 2 or 3. So we were very surprised sort of how diverse this was. It's a good question. We don't have a ton of data on this, but I do think it's, Eva, you might remember better sort of when we saw them opening a new establishment, how often was it in a new city? And I think it was like 30 or 40% of the time.
Yes, that is correct, based on my recollection as well.
Yeah.
And would you know about a similar thing for contractions? So, would they just pull out of a city, or would they just reduce the number of people in cities? Yeah, just curious there.
That I can't quite remember. I don't remember that, what the stats were on that.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry. Okay, well, again, thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate all the feedback, especially on early stage work. Good to see so many familiar names. Here's some familiar voices. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I'll try to make these more often because this is a great format.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and you finished right on time. I was very happy to see all the active participation. David, do you want to make any announcement about the future date?
Sure, yeah, thanks again, Andrew and Eva, for presenting this awesome paper to open our fall program. We have a bunch of great papers coming up. Our next paper will be, our next seminar will be in 2 weeks from now, where Cameron Lapointe from Yale will be presenting his really interesting paper on spatially targeted LTV policies. I hope you can all make it. I think it's a great paper.